Hi everybody, welcome to U.S. History since 1865. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Bush presidency and the legacy of the Bush years. The textbook covers this in some detail, but I just wanted to add a few more details and point you to some of the things that I think are important to get out of this chapter in the textbook. So, the terrorist attacks of September 11th hijacked not only the United States' foreign policy, but also came to dominate and affect the country's domestic policy. And it has shaped the government that we have to this very day. So when Bush takes the presidency or takes office in the early 2000s, he is almost immediately he has to deal with the September 11th terrorist attacks, which are described in the textbook. And in the aftermath of those attacks, President Bush outlines a new foreign policy priority and a new foreign policy agenda, and that is to fight the war on terror. So in the aftermath of September 11th, President Bush articulates what becomes known as the Bush Doctrine. And the Bush Doctrine is the ideology that will drive U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of September 11th. What it says is that the U.S. can unilaterally, that means alone, without permission of other people, without working with other people, can unilaterally fight the war on terror. And that any groups, and that includes any groups that might threaten U.S. stability and security, and that the U.S. is prepared to go after them, even if it means going after them by themselves. So the first target of the Bush Doctrine in the post-September 11th world is the Taliban in Afghanistan, because the Taliban sheltered al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who had planned the September 11th attacks, and they refused to turn them over. So the U.S. goes to war with Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001. And by 2002, the Taliban has been driven from power, and a new government has been established. But they didn't really control the country, and by 2007, the Taliban makes a resurgence. The second target of the Bush Doctrine and the war on terror is what Bush calls the so-called axis of evil. In January 2002, President Bush gives a speech, and he says that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea all harbor terrorists and weapons of mass destruction. And they're a threat to the U.S. stability. He calls them the axis of evil. They, however, have nothing to do with September 11th, and they didn't cooperate with al-Qaeda. But still, the U.S. said they were a threat. And in the lead up to the war in Iraq, top U.S. administrators were told that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, had weapons of mass destruction, that he wanted to build nuclear arms, and that the U.S. needed to do something about it, and specifically that the U.S. needed to initiate regime change. Domestic critics that said that this was a bad idea. In particular, Colin Powell said that in order to do regime change in Iraq, the U.S. would need hundreds of thousands of soldiers and international allies. Domestic critics said that this would be a distraction and that the U.S. could not unilaterally topple a regime and establish democracy. That the U.S. alone could never properly address the issues facing the Middle East. Others suggested that the Bush administration was doing this because of Iraq's crucial oil reserves. And critically, journalists didn't ask questions, and they repeated simply what the president's line was. And in March 2003, despite massive opposition internationally and a massive anti-war movement, the U.S. initiates Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Congress gives President Bush the go-ahead. And the U.S. goes to war in Iraq. Quickly, the U.S. soldiers overrun Baghdad, the capital, and President Bush declares that mission was accomplished, and Saddam Hussein was found and executed in 2006. But as we know today, mission was not accomplished, and Iraq descended into chaos and looting. An insurgency rose up of loyalists to the old regime, of nationalists. Foreign revolutionaries joined, and they all targeted U.S. soldiers and Iraqi allies. And the war became a quagmire for the United States. It also resulted in U.S. isolation internationally. Globally, other nations resented the U.S.'s willingness to break international laws, and they believed that the United States was motivated by self-interest, by Iraqi oil reserves, etc. U.S. citizens, meanwhile, truly did believe that there had been weapons of mass destruction, but by 2007, we knew that there were not, and many Americans believed that the war in Iraq had been a mistake. But by then, it had cost the lives of several thousands of Iraqi civilians and soldiers, as well as American soldiers. It also had pretty serious consequences for the domestic front. In particular, in the wake of the September 11th attacks, war was very popular. There was a real sense of American aggrievement and woundedness, and a desire for vengeance that I think drove the popularity of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The other issue was that there wasn't a draft and there weren't any new taxes. But that should immediately raise questions, because war is expensive, and if there aren't new taxes, how are we paying for it? And we'll talk about that in a minute. The war's popularity also meant that there was an extreme reaction to anti-war sentiment, extreme reaction to it, and a violent reaction to it. Anyone from famous musicians who spoke out against the war to ordinary professors and students were severely threatened. They were punished in many different ways. The Dixie Chicks is just one example. In 2003, at a concert in London, they said that they were ashamed that the president was from Texas, and that they were opposed to the war in Iraq, and that really ruined their careers. Hundreds of listeners would call into local radio stations demanding that they stop playing their music simply because they disagreed with what the Dixie Chicks had said. They received death threats, but it wasn't just them. It wasn't just famous people. It was also ordinary people. College students were threatened with rape, with death threats for protesting the war. Professors, one Yale historian, Glenda Gilmore, spoke out against the war in her campus newspaper, and she received rape and death threats. Students protesting were harassed. The families of the victims of September 11th who protested the war were told to, quote, go back to the 60s, and they were accused of being un-American. So in the lead up to war, as often happened in this country, we saw this in the lead up to World War I too, any sign of dissent became seen as sedition, and basically as being un-American, as treasonous. And that really was the first sign of the dangers to come. In the lead up to the war, the U.S. Congress would give the federal government, or rather the central government, the presidency, tremendous powers. And that is what one of the podcasts that you're listening to today is about. The U.S. government built essentially a surveillance state in the wake of September 11th. That's what the USA Patriot Act did. It rolled back privacy and security guarantees that had emerged in the 1970s. It allowed law enforcement to use wiretaps, to open letters, to read emails, to look at library records, to freeze assets of anyone who was suspected of cooperating with terrorism, but they got to define what terrorism meant, which meant that this, in some cases, was interpreted very broadly. It meant that people's civil liberties were compromised. In the wake of the Patriot Act and September 11th, the U.S. Government officials rounded up 5,000 people of Middle Eastern descent. 1,200 were arrested, and there was no link to terrorism, but they were held for months without charges. The other aspect of the Bush presidency that I want to cover is that while President Bush was focused on terrorism and security, domestic issues fell by the wayside, and that really ruined and tanked President Bush's approval ratings. The first example of this is what happened with Hurricane Katrina, a major hurricane that devastated New Orleans, and in particular devastated historically Black neighborhoods in New Orleans that were in low-lying areas and that were flooded. The Federal Emergency Management Administration had been moved to be part of the Department of Homeland Security, and it just simply wasn't a priority. So when Hurricane Katrina hit, it killed 1,800 people. It destroyed 160,000 homes, caused over $100 billion in damages, and the U.S. government was simply not prepared to meet it. And again, you'll read about this more in the textbook. This is a period when President Bush really handed over the rebuilding of New Orleans to private corporations, faith-based organizations, and they simply weren't up to the task. And New Orleans, it changed the face of New Orleans to this day. The second aspect of the domestic policy agenda that we need to talk about is the economy. President Bush, as a conservative, had run on tax cuts, on lowering interest rates. As soon as he comes to office, he does that. He lowers interest rates. He issues more tax cuts, the largest in U.S. history. But that became an issue as we became more and more embroiled in war. Because how are we going to pay for this war, which was tremendously costly? Between 2001 and 2012, it's estimated that the U.S. or Congress appropriated $1.4 trillion to fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that number doesn't include the foreign aid that we offer to those countries. It doesn't include the interest on loans that we took out to pay for military expenses, etc. In fact, by 2004, the U.S. debt had ballooned to $400 billion. But then in 2008, the U.S. economy tanks. As I had said, the federal government had kept interest rates very low to help recover from a recession in the year 2000. And Americans borrowed money to buy houses, and they were buying on credit. But in 2008, the U.S. enters into another much deeper recession that was really triggered by the subprime loan industry. Subprime loans are risky loans because they are given to people who don't make enough money to pay back those loans. And they were not very carefully regulated in this period. In fact, the federal government did nothing under the belief that the market is going to take care of the issue. And people borrowed, and they, like I said, used the money to build homes, fueled by this belief that housing, in the housing market. But by 2006, so many houses had been built that prices started to fall, and eventually people owed more on their houses than those houses were worth. They lost their homes, and the banks lost so much money that they had to stop making loans, and business fell, and the stock market tanked, and this is what led to the Great Recession of 2008. The recession would last until about 2009, although we're still dealing with the after effects of it. It really exacerbated inequality in this country. Wall Street was firing workers at the same time that they were giving their executives bonuses of upwards of $1 billion. President Bush and President Obama chose to bail out the banks to the tune of $700 billion out of fear that if those banks fail, they would lead to a domino effect. But they didn't really offer that much help to homeowners who were losing their houses. Under Reagan, Clinton, Bush, the Bushes, welfare had been severely limited, and now unemployment was quite high, and the social safety net had been eroded. So this is what we have to think about when we think about the legacy of the Bush years. The economy was in a terrible state. It was at the worst it had been since the Great Depression. The U.S. was facing a huge debt and embroiled in 2 wars with no end in sight. And that's to say nothing of the global cost of those wars, of the hundreds of thousands of lives lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the legacy that President Obama inherits when he comes to office in 2008. And that's where we're going to leave it for this class. The textbook will take it all the way up to the Trump years, so I want to make sure that you go over that. We might talk a little bit more about that in the next week, but this is just a broad overview of the Bush years. I just wanted to highlight some key points for you to think about as we wind up the class and as you think about your final projects. All right, any questions, send me an email.